Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth meeting for 2021 of the Justice Committee. We have no apologies this morning, and we're joined today by Dean Lockhart, Joanne Lamont, Margaret Mitchell, and the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Humza Yousaf. And I welcome you all to our meeting this morning. Agenda item 1 is Stage 2 consideration of the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill, and members should have with them for this the marshalled list and the groupings. And before we start, I just want to underline that this is a fully virtual meeting and that we will be using the chat function on BlueJeans as a means of voting electronically today. When we do vote, I will call for members of the committee to type Y in the chat function to record any votes for yes, and then I'll do the same in turn for no, typing N, and abstain, typing A. The clerks will then collate the results and I will read them out and confirm which member has voted in which way. And if I make any errors, then please alert me immediately so that we can correct it. I will take the voting as slowly as we need to in order to ensure that we will have time to manage this properly. The Cabinet Secretary is joined by a number of officials. They're also very welcome this morning, but I need to remind them, I'm afraid, that they cannot speak during this stage, but they can, of course, communicate directly with the Cabinet Secretary. Finally, by way of introduction, if we do lose connection at any point, then I'll suspend the meeting and try and get the member back into the meeting. If we can't do that after a reasonable period of time, I will have to deem that the member is not present and then consider with the deputy convener if we can proceed or if we need to suspend for longer. I do intend to take a short break at about 10 past or 11:15, and the meeting this morning will not go beyond 12:30. We are unlikely to finish the Stage 2 consideration today, and which means that we will come back next week to continue it. Are there any questions about anything that I've just said before we get underway? If not, then I think we can move to the first group, which is on freedom of expression. And I would like to call Amendment 103 in the name of Liam MacArthur, grouped with other amendments as shown in the groupings. And I will point out that if Amendment 117 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 81 due to preemption. So Liam MacArthur to move Amendment 103 and speak to all amendments in the group, please. Liam.
Thanks very much, Convener. We live in a gloriously diverse world and we are all the stronger because of it. Evidence shows that societies and economies are healthier when every person can contribute. And that means stopping the discrimination that rules many people out of living their lives to the full. Genuine equality of opportunity means equality no matter what we look like, who we are, or where we come from. As a Liberal, of course, I believe passionately in freedom of expression, even where the exercise of that freedom can be challenging, unpleasant, or offensive. But there are also necessary limits on that freedom where it impinges on the rights of others. Freedom of expression does not amount to a freedom to erode the rights of others. Establishing the thresholds and limits of this in criminal law, though, is not either easy or straightforward, but it is, I believe, the fundamental challenge we need to meet in amending this piece of legislation. Having pursued the issue of freedom of expression protections with every panel of witnesses we heard from at Stage 1, it has been a priority for me as we moved into Stage 2. I welcomed the Cabinet Secretary's offer to look at how such protections could be, quote, widened and deepened, but came to the view that this opened up the risk of a piecemeal approach. As the Equality and Human Rights Commission have identified, this brings with it its own problems. It's why ultimately I was attracted to the idea of a catch-all freedom of expression amendment. Amendment 103 reflects such an approach. I note the Equality Network and Scottish Trans Alliance both strongly support the principle of this amendment, arguing that the general freedom of expression provision covering stirring up offences generally is preferable to, quote, singling out certain protected characteristics being more acceptable to criticise. That said, I fully accept that Amendment 103 is flawed and requires further refinement. It does, though, I think, provide a basis on which to strike the balance we all wish to see. Indeed, it has already served a purpose by opening up discussions between members of the committee and the government, as well as with key stakeholders, about how such a catch-all amendment could be made to work. At the same time, I'm aware of concerns that if we're not careful, the process of arriving at an approach that addresses our collective concerns may lack the necessary transparency. Taking further evidence between Stage 2 and Stage 3 is almost certainly impractical within the time frame available, which has already proved enormously challenging for the committee. Nevertheless, a way will need to be found to expose any proposed wording to the widest possible scrutiny and input ahead of stage 3. Some suggestions have already been put forward on how Amendment 103 might be improved, and I'm grateful to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, for example, for their constructive proposals, drawing on the wording used in the 2014 Marriage and Civil Partnership Act. This may not quite suffice, given that we are dealing with the criminal law and the additional pressure to provide clarity around scope and application, but it may offer a basis on which to develop something more suitable. In terms of the clarity that's needed, I think the Equality Network make a reasonable point in observing that no single piece of legislation can be expected to comprehensively list all the things that are not criminal. Rather, the criminal law is designed to articulate what behaviour is not allowed in our society. That's still not straightforward and certainly still requires clarity, but it is, I think, a useful frame of reference. I look forward to hearing the views of colleagues and the Cabinet Secretary in relation to Amendment 3. Turning briefly to the other amendments in this group, for the reasons I've set out already, obviously the approach taken by the Cabinet Secretary in Amendment 65 in relation to age and Amendment 82 on gender are not ones I can support. The same is true of Liam Kerr's Amendment 81 and 82B, and for the sake of balance, my own Amendment 81A, which was an attempt to explore alternative means of addressing this issue, but which I'll not be moving. I think Amendment 117 in John Finney's name is interesting, in referring to criticism as matters relating to sexual orientation. It appears less open to being targeted at individuals, but I look forward to hearing the thinking behind John Finney's approach here. And on Amendment 112 in the name of Rhoda Grant, I can understand the intention, but would be concerned at the scope this would allow for actions and behaviour that purport to be for the purpose of advocating women's rights, but go well beyond anything I expect Rhoda Grant would wish to see endorsed. Finally, notwithstanding what I've said, it seems to me the Cabinet Secretary's Amendments 77, 78, 79 do not trigger the same issues as the other amendments in this group. They appear to be a reasonable response to the overwhelming written and oral evidence we receive from a broad range of groups representing faiths, religions and the secular community. On that basis, I'm comfortable supporting these proposed changes. Hate crime legislation should not be used to criminalise good faith, well-intentioned and respectful debate, even where the views expressed in that debate are found to be unpleasant, hurtful and offensive. We also know that many people have genuine questions about changing the process of gender recognition. This bill should not criminalise those conversations, but there are vulnerable people in this conversation who also need and deserve to be protected too, and I move Amendment 103 in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr MacArthur. I call the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 65 and other amendments in this group. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Good morning, Convener, and to all committee members. I'm hoping you can hear me loud and clear. If not, I have a pair of fetching headsets, which I am happy to wear. If the sound drops off at any point, please just do alert me to that. Can I thank Liam MacArthur for his remarks, and I will speak to the amendments in this group. But members will be aware that the purpose of the freedom of expression protections provisions in the bill is to provide that reassurance and greater clarity about the boundaries of the criminal law. This reassurance is provided through provisions that highlights behaviours that will continue to be legal once the stirring up hatred offences are implemented. Transgender identity in particular has repeatedly been cited as requiring new provisions to help clarify the operation of the new stirring up hatred offence in relation to transgender identity. And let me make it clear, just as Liam MacArthur has said too, nothing in this bill stops robust debate or indeed even criticism of such policy as GRA, Gender Reform, the Gender Reform Act proposals, or indeed any other policy being put forward, so long as that behaviour, of course, does not cross the line into being threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. There are also, above and beyond the issue of transgender identity, clear and compelling calls for provisions across all characteristics. There are, of course, also differing views on how best reassurance and clarity can be achieved. So it's incumbent upon us all to work together to strike the appropriate balance, and it's for this reason that despite lodging amendments 65 and 82 in this group, I would advise that I will not be moving either of these amendments, as it's clear that there is no agreement yet on the best approach to this particular matter. I would like to thank members of the opposition who I have engaged with over the last few days for agreeing to take a collaborative approach to finding a solution that hopefully we can all agree to and agree on in advance of stage 3. A solution that gives both comfort to those who are concerned about free speech, but also protects communities from hatred. I've always said that the two are not mutually exclusive. I will, however, be moving amendments 77, 78 and 79 on religion for the reasons that I will explain and reasons alluded to by Liam McArthur in his remarks. Convener, it's apparent there is a lack of consensus about how to approach freedom of expression protections. That much is clear from the reaction to the various amendments lodged in the area of freedom of expression. That's exemplified by the fact that Amendment 82A from Liam McArthur and Amendment 82B from Liam Kerr have been lodged to adjust my Amendment 82, yet both take quite radically different policy paths in how they seek to amend Amendment 82. Following discussions in recent days that all of us who have lodged amendments in respect to freedom of expression have been involved in, it's my view, right that we now take some time between stage 2 and stage 3 to reflect and see if we can develop a collaborative approach which can produce a set of provisions that commands general support across the board. Notwithstanding my intention not to move Amendment 65 and 82, I will offer some very brief commentary on them as well as speak to the other amendments in the group. If I begin with Amendment 103, which we've just heard from Liam McArthur on, this seeks to add a general protection of freedom of expression provision, which would apply to all characteristics in the bill. The amendment also seeks to make clear that nothing within the bill would affect the person's Article 10 rights under ECHR. I don't doubt at all that Amendment 103 is well intentioned, and indeed subsection 1 of the provision is probably the type of freedom of expression protection applying as it does across the characteristics that is likely to inform the solution that is probably necessary. As Liam McArthur has already recognised, there are certain technical and indeed some policy concerns about how the amendment seeks to achieve this, and I'll explain them very, very briefly. The most important issue with subsection 1 of 103 is that it would appear to disapply the operation of the stirring up offences. This is because it provides that, and I quote, "Nothing in this Act prohibits discussion or criticism relating to the characteristics." We know the policy of stirring up hatred offences is that if discussion or criticism relating to characteristics amounts to behaviour or material that is threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred, then of course the Act would prohibit such discussion or criticism. The practical effect of subsection 1 of Amendment 103 is that a person could discuss or criticise race, religion in a threatening or abusive manner with the intention of stirring up hatred against Jews, Muslims, black people, and no offence would be committed. Again, I know that is not what Liam McArthur has sought to do through Amendment 103. Ahead of stage 3, it is, however, likely a provision can be developed that is capable of providing for certain types of behaviour or material that are not solely to be taken to be threatening or abusive for characteristics in the bill. In respect to subsection 2 of Amendment 103, I also have some concerns. Again, Liam McArthur touched upon what some of those concerns may well be, but it is largely around the compatibility of subsection 2, or what subsection 2 does, in fact, to the compatibility of provisions in the bill with ECHR rights, without providing at the same time any additional guidance on the boundaries of the criminal law, and that could create some unwelcome legal uncertainty, and again, where other provisions in other law may well mirror what is in subsection 2. Liam McArthur is right to point out there is a different threshold and indeed different implications for the criminal law versus civil law. So as I say, I do think we can use Liam McArthur's 103, particularly subsection 1, as a potential starting base for considerations that we may have between stage 2 and 3 in relation to a broader provision, freedom of expression provision. If I can quickly turn to Amendments 77, 78 and 79 on religion, which I can advise I will be moving. I consider there should be a minimum standard freedom of expression protection for characteristics in the bill. That's something I've just, as I've said, I've agreed to work on with other colleagues in a collaborative manner. However, on religion, drawing on the general consensus for specific protections relating to religion, my view is that there should be additional protections which my amendments 77, 78 and 79 seek to provide. As I've stated throughout the scrutiny of the bill, the Scottish Government recognises the importance of balancing freedom of expression with the right of people to be protected from hateful speech. These are not mutually exclusive aims. I'm also aware of concerns that some have expressed about the extension of the stirring up hatred offences to religion and the perceived likelihood of possible self-censorship which may arise in the right to, for example, express views about faith or discuss and debate religious matters. That is, of course, not the intention of the legislation. So it is important to recognise the right to freedom of expression is not without limit, and we must strike an appropriate balance between respecting the rights of expression and ensuring victims are sufficiently protected. For characteristics in the bill, we will work together to achieve effective protection for consideration at stage 3. However, I think these additional protections for religion are needed, and I'm comforted by the fact that many witnesses and stakeholders, including those from faith groups such as the Catholic Church, have indicated that the current provisions in section 11 of the bill could be usefully be more closely aligned with the equivalent provisions in the English and Welsh legislation under the Public Order Act 1986. And that is effectively what Amendments 77, 78 and 79 seek to do. So I will move those amendments, and I would ask members to support Amendments 77 to 79. As I indicated, I will not be moving Amendments 65 and 82. I will just briefly again explain why they were brought forward originally, the approach taken. This is so I can put on record how the approach protecting freedom of expression as a general approach taken for these specific characteristics could be capable of application to all characteristics in the bill. So for age, in terms of Amendment 65, it would have inserted a new section after Section 10 of the bill, which provides for a freedom of expression provision in relation to the characteristic of age for the purpose of the stirring up offences in Section 3.2 of the bill. Subsections 1 and 2 of the new section would have provided that for the purposes, behaviour or material is not to be taken to be threatening or abusive solely on the basis that it involves discussion or criticism of matters relating to age, whether relating to age generally or to a particular age or indeed age range. Amendment 82 would have inserted a new section after Section 12 of the bill, which provides for a freedom of expression provision in relation to the characteristic of transgender identity for the purpose of stirring up hatred offence in Section 3.2 of the bill. The approach taken for Amendment 82 would have been similar to that one of age, which I've just spoken to. There have been two amendments to Amendment 82, which I have already previously just touched upon. Amendments 117 and 81 seek to adjust the existing protections of freedom of expression provision for the characteristic of sexual orientation in Section 12 of the bill. Amendment 81, lodged by Liam Kerr, would add a new specific matter to the protections in Section 12 relating to the sex of parties involved in marriages. After a constructive discussion, without preempting, I hope the member understand that he's agreed not to move his amendments in this regard, and I welcome that agreement. Similarly, I've had constructive dialogue with John Finney on Amendment 117. It would largely remove the existing provisions in Section 12.2 and replace it with a protection in respect of discussion or criticism of sexual orientation. The existing provision is more focused on sexual practices and conduct, which would still be covered by Amendment 117. On balance and in line with what I hope and expect will be a collaborative approach ahead of Stage 3, I would ask Mr Finney not to move 117. And very finally, I will speak to Amendment 112 lodged by Rhoda Grant, which again I hope will not be moved in light of constructive engagement we have had over the last few days. But it is clear From scrutiny of the bill, that protection of freedom of expression is a key element of the overall safeguards within the bill. Such provisions have an important role in reassuring but also providing clarity to the boundaries of the stirring up offences. Amendment 112 relates to protections for freedom of expression in relation to advocating for women's rights. It's important the bill does not inadvertently cause anyone who wishes to discuss or criticise matters relating to women's rights in a non-threatening or abusive manner to have to self-censor because they fear that they may be committing an offence. Let me say that I too absolutely recognise that there are well-founded, well-held and sincerely held beliefs from many women that they have a concern that they would have to self-censor due to what is in the hate crime bill. That is absolutely not the intention of the bill, and I am committed to providing reassurance through a freedom of expression clause, hopefully a broad freedom of expression clause that can apply to all characteristics, that we can give that comfort to the many women who have raised these concerns. As I say, the fact that the new offences can only be committed where behaviour is threatening or abusive, and if my amendments 1 to 4 are agreed in a later group, intended to stir up hatred, then that in itself is an important safeguard. The effect of 112, however, would be that where behaviour or material was threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred in respect of any of the characteristics in the bill, such as race, religion, or transgender identity, this would be permitted if it was in the context of advocating for women's rights, and that's something I can't support. I know Rhoda Grant's amendment is well-intentioned, but it is deeply flawed. It could mean, for example, that somebody could, under the guise of protecting women's rights or advocating for women's rights, engage in racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and that would be covered by this freedom of expression clause. Again, I know not the intention of Rhoda Grant. So I've had constructive dialogue with Ms Grant, and I hope she'll agree not to move Amendment 112, but agree to work together with other members so that we can come forward with a broader freedom of expression clause that will cover all the protected characteristics. My door has been open, it remains open. I will continue to discuss with stakeholders across a wide range of interests, as well as with the opposition, to ensure that we can come forward with a freedom of expression clause at stage 3 that can command as much support as possible across wider society. And people expect us to be able to work together to rise to this challenge, and I'm sure that we absolutely can. Thank you, Convener and Committee.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I call John Finney next to speak to Amendment 117 and other amendments in the group. Mr. Finney.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener, and good morning, everyone. I think already, Convener, we've heard the worth of our system of scrutiny, building on the committee Stage 1 report. I think the Cabinet Secretary has already said two very key words: reassurance, the reassurance we all want to see in relation to freedom of expression, but equally absolute clarity about what the law says, what it doesn't say. So I think we all know that legislation which has lists immediately raises questions about what's not on the list or what should be on the list. And my amendment 117, which was adding to a list, was taking the same approach in relation to sexual orientation as Amendments 65 and 82 took in relation to age and transgender identity. Now, that would have been a significant improvement of the existing Section 12, because it would move what the Equality Network have referred to as the laundry list, and there are some very unpleasant things on this list. I'm delighted that my amendment would have preempted 81 and perhaps Lise said she was amended about 82B. But the removal of language relating to conversion therapy, for instance. But what's, I think, even this far into the debate, what's very clear is that perhaps a general freedom of expression provision is something that would be preferable. And to that end, can I align myself with many of the comments of both the previous speakers, particularly my colleague Liam MacArthur in relation to his amendment 103, because this general approach doesn't single out protected characteristics, thereby, in some people's eyes, making it more acceptable for these people to be open to criticism. And we do know that words are important. They're important because we want to see robust provision of freedom of expression, but we also want to see clarity about hate crime. We want there to be no debate as to what constitutes that. And there's no doubt that if we get this wrong, there's a danger that we embolden would-be perpetrators in reinforcing the idea that LGBTI people are for some reason less valuable. Again, referring to the Equality Network briefing, which was very helpful, and I thank all those who have given us briefings, they talk about the chilling effect of confidence. And I think that's something that can't be underestimated. You know, many people who are able to see things over a longer term can understand the advances that have been made, and largely due to education rather than legislation in people's outlook. And we want no regression in that whatsoever. And I fear that there was a potential for that to happen. I think the willingness of all parties to engage in discussions about this can hopefully sort that. So I'm not going to say much more other than to say that in relation to 112, precision of drafting is absolutely clear. My colleague Rhoda Grant, I know, would never condone stirring up hatred. It's just a clumsily worded amendment, and I wouldn't be supporting 112. In relation to the Cabinet Secretary's remarks about religion, these are amendments 77, 78, 79. I will be lending support to that. I think we heard in committee convener that there was strong support for that approach, and I think it's important that that's reflected in the legislation that is passed. Most of all, I want to conclude by saying the collaborative approach that's been alluded to, I hope will continue, and I hope that's the way we make best legislation. Our obligation is to make good law, and we do that if we work together. So I'll conclude there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Finney. Now I call Liam Kerr to speak to Amendment 81 and other amendments in the group. Mr. Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I have two amendments in the group Freedom of Expression. It is no secret from my contributions both to the original debate I called on this bill and at stage one that I think the stirring up offences and protections in part two suffer from real challenges. As I set out clearly in debate, were it up to me, we would have taken these away from the bill to deal with them separately and out of the extraordinarily truncated timetable we currently find ourselves in. However, we are where we are, and it's my firm belief that if the government insists on putting limits on freedom of speech, it has a duty to make absolutely clear, without ambiguity, what those limits are. The clarity of precision that John Finney just rightly talked about. Pretty much all of my amendments to this bill start from that position, to try and make this bill as tightly drafted as it can be so that the bill not only protects those people whom the bill seeks to protect, but also that it does not inadvertently create grey areas and uncertainty. We have to be clear and unambiguous in this bill to ensure that those who require protection get it, and those who wish to exercise freedom of expression are able to do so and know precisely the limits. So when the Cabinet Secretary said earlier, nothing in this bill will criminalise certain things, people need to be clear on that. Now, the situation we find ourselves in, all colleagues have been required to draft and lodge our amendments in an extraordinarily tight window, and now to debate them. And we all recognise, I believe, our duty to make this bill as good and workable as possible. That is the purpose of amending, after all. In this way, the coverage, but also protections required, can be ensured to work. Now, the Cabinet Secretary articulated his view that in the case of the freedom of expression amendments, this may be more productively achieved through reflective, collaborative working, wherein all MSPs can articulate what we seek to achieve. We can work with stakeholders and ensure that whatever mechanism we use to protect both the protected categories, but also freedom of expression works. Now, Liam MacArthur mentioned earlier the briefing note from the Equality and Human Rights Council, and I noted that too, because it rightly suggests that there currently exists the risk of a piecemeal approach. And I think the debate today goes toward that. There is merit in many of the amendments in this group, but as other speakers have articulated, there are challenges and limitations to all, and we have to get this right. Now, I am persuaded by that case, and I think there must be merit in working collaboratively but transparently and openly to come up with an amendment or amendments which tighten this bill appropriately and ensure the protections needed work. Now, the Cabinet Secretary in his remarks articulated that things are absolutely not the intention of the bill. That's as may be, but it is imperative that intention is translated into legal certainty, the absolute clarity that John Finney referred to. For these reasons, Convener, I shall not be pressing my amendments 81 and 82B today, but look forward to working with colleagues and stakeholders to make this bill as good as it can be.
Thank you, Mr. Kerr. And now I call Rhoda Grant to speak to Amendment 112 and other amendments in the group. Rhoda.
Thank you, Convener, and I wish to speak to Amendment 112 and other amendments. While I understand the evidence received from Engender and other organisations and what they say about hate crime towards women being based on a power dynamic, which is different from hate crime suffered by minority groups, I still believe that leaving misogyny out of the legislation could leave women at a disadvantage, because it could be deemed to be hateful to stand up against misogyny but have no protection from it at all. So my amendment was not a general freedom of expression amendment, but it was put in place in order to give some protection in the bill for a group subject to hate crime but not covered by the bill. Now, I do understand that there is power to add misogyny at a later date, but I'm keen that women get protection from the start, even if that protection is then removed at the time that we legislate against misogyny. I know my amendment doesn't do that or achieve what I was looking to achieve, and the last thing I want to do is provide a loophole, so therefore it's a probing amendment to get the thoughts of the Cabinet Secretary and the committee with a view to taking back an amendment that gives that protection at stage 3. I'm attracted to Liam MacArthur's approach as well, to giving a more general freedom of speech protection, but I want to see some balance in the bill that gives protection against misogyny as well. I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for the discussions and indeed would very much want to be part of the discussions going forward, both with the Cabinet Secretary, committee members and all stakeholders to get this bill right, because I believe we have just one chance to do that and we need to make sure that it is right for everybody concerned. So I will not be pressing my amendment, but look forward to working with others going forward.
Thank you very much, Rhoda. I'm going to call Fulton McGregor in a minute, but before I do so, I want to add a few words of my own in this debate, given the importance of the subject matter and given the centrality of this question to the committee's Stage 1 report, in which we concluded unanimously all of our conclusions and recommendations in our Stage 1 report were reached and made unanimously. At paragraph 44, we said this: the committee agrees that the right to freedom of speech includes the right to offend, shock or disturb. And the committee understands that the bill is not intended to prohibit speech which others may find offensive, and neither is it intended to lead to any self-censorship. But the committee is anxious to ensure that these are not the unintended consequences of the bill. And that anxiety, I think, is evident in a number of the contributions that we've heard so far this morning. In my Stage 1 speech, in the Stage 1 debate on this bill, I started by reciting some of the American criticisms that I have been reading about ever since I first read this hate crime bill, about why hate speech laws are not the right way to combat hate in society. And that isn't my view, but I wanted to read the view of those free speech lawyers and advocates and campaigners who take the view, which is very commonly taken in the United States, that the way to combat hate is with more speech, not less. And their criticisms of hate speech laws and the criticisms really resonate with me as I read this bill, as I think about it and as I puzzle over it. The criticisms are boiled down to two. There is a criticism of vagueness, that we lack precision when we ban speech, when we criminalize aspects of speech, we lack precision. and that there is a risk of overbreadth. And it seems to me that the amendments in this group, all of them, all of the amendments in this group are designed to mitigate those risks, to meet that challenge. How can we legislate to criminalise hate speech without falling into the trap of vagueness and without falling into the trap of overbreadth? And I want to say a few things about that, particularly in the context of the ongoing and very difficult debate over transgender identity and its role in this bill. Because it seems to me that the events of the last few days, the reaction to the amendments that have been put down in this group with regard to transgender identity, make it just even more obvious and apparent that we absolutely must define what we mean. And I have to say, I have been disturbed by the reaction I've seen to what I thought were really quite modest, innocent and perfectly reasonable amendments in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. I'm talking about Amendment 82 in particular, which I would have voted for today if it had been moved and pressed. But it's clear that even the words that the Cabinet Secretary has very carefully chosen in Amendment 82 have caused fear, alarm and distress. And I take that fear, alarm and distress very seriously, but I also have to say, colleagues, that I am alarmed and distressed, and perhaps even, if I'm honest, a little afraid of the reaction or aspects of the reaction to it. Now, yesterday, a party leader of one of the parties in the Scottish Parliament, tweeted that, in his view, a number of the amendments put down to the hate crime bill for stage 2 were shockingly and overtly transphobic. And I think we have come to the point where, if we are going to criminalise hate speech on grounds of transgender identity, we have got to define what we mean. Because it seems to me I struggled to find an amendment in this or any other group that I thought was shockingly or overtly transphobic. If we take, for example, the words of Liam Kerr's Amendment 82B, and I don't know if this is the amendment that MSP I've just referred to was talking about in his tweet, but stating that sex is an immutable biological characteristic does not make you transphobic. Stating that there are only two sexes, does that make you transphobic, really? Using the word woman or man and equivalent terms or pronouns in a certain way, does that make you transphobic? Is that the sort of speech that we are trying to criminalise here? It seems to me that a sort of conclusion has been reached behind closed doors with the parties represented in the Parliament, that the way forward is to find some sort of generic free speech clause based on, but not identical to, Amendment 103 in Liam MacArthur's name. And what I worry about this, I have to say, I really worry about this. Given that the problems we're trying to tackle are problems of vagueness and overbreadth, having a generic rather than a series of very specific clauses might not meet that challenge. I don't rule out the possibility that something based on Amendment 103 might turn out to be the solution, but I just want to put down that marker. That I think that if the challenge is to combat the problems of vagueness in the criminal law and overbreadth, then having a generic rather than a series of very specific and carefully worded free speech provisions in this bill might not be the solution that some people currently seem to think it is. To put a slightly different gloss on this, I've always thought that actually it's not the free speech clauses that will in the end do the real work in terms of delimiting and defining the scope of the offences. I think it's the words that we use in the bill that define the offences themselves. And I think, for example, the amendments in the Cabinet Secretary's name in a later group, amendments which I have supported, that may ensure that the word abusive is defined and understood objectively by imposing or inserting into the bill on its face a reasonable person test, are likely to do much more work in practice in terms of defining and delimiting the scope of these offences than free speech provisions. But in conclusion, I would like to say this. I support the collaborative approach, of course I do. but a collaborative approach in lawmaking on a subject as sensitive and difficult as this, whereas Liam MacArthur said, we're talking at one and the same time about matters of fundamental principle and about some very vulnerable people. That lawmaking, that collaborative approach surely has to be in Parliament and in public, and not behind closed doors in rooms with party representatives talking only to themselves. I think John Finney is absolutely right. We need absolute clarity in this area of law, and I am one of those people who now needs more reassurance about this than I did 48 or 72 hours ago, because of some of the things I've seen written about in the context of these amendments. I'm less reassured now than I was a few days ago that we're going to be able to fix this and fix this appropriately. That's what I wanted to say in the context of this debate, and I'd now bring in Fulton McGregor.
Thanks, Convener. I wanted to speak about Amendment 65 and 82 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. And, you know, I agree with a lot of what you've said there, Convener. I think that, you know, a reasonable analysis of particularly Amendment 82 would quickly determine that it was a well-intended and modest, as you put it, amendment to tighten up the legislation. And unfortunately, as you've also alluded to, that is not perhaps how it's been interpreted over the last few days in some aspects. But you know, I do have to say that's probably where up to that point I would agree with you, Convener, because I do think that while maybe not to the extreme extent that we've seen perhaps on social media, when I first seen the amendment, I did have some concerns. Not, as I've said, about the intention behind the amendment, certainly not, and having an understanding of this bill, which the 9 of us and people who have been following it, but maybe general public don't, but perhaps the unintended consequences that could have come out of it. And we all know there's a heated debate going on, and I have to say that I was worried that, you know, that this could lead to further isolation or marginalisation of our transgender communities, and that was a concern that I've heard. So, you know, I'm glad that the Cabinet Secretary has said that he won't press the amendment. And that, you know, we can go back to the drawing board with this. I think that is definitely the best place to be. I agree as well with the Equality Network, Stonewall Scotland, and the Scots Trans Alliance that perhaps a more broader, generalised definition that incorporates all hate crime would be beneficial. I do appreciate the concerns that have been raised by yourself, Convener, and others with this, but I do think that is the way forward. I would obviously like to say quite clearly that there must be freedom of expression. We've all agreed that throughout the committee's scrutiny of this, and that's got to include all debates that we have, including the gender reform debate that's been had just now. There has to be scope, there has to be permission for folk to hold strongly held views on both sides of this debate. We, as a committee and a parliament, need to work together, get into stage 3 to get this right. I agree with you. I think it's going to be very difficult. In your final comments, you said that, but I think it's also a really good opportunity at the very end of this session of Parliament for this Parliament to come together, work together, and find a solution. And I am confident that we'll be able to do it. And I just wanted to speak to those amendments. Convener, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. And I should have said I certainly pledge myself, for what it's worth, to help to work with the Cabinet Secretary and anybody else, preferably in public, to resolve these issues, which we can't, it seems, resolve today. I call Rona Mackay next, please. Rona.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I mean, I want to agree with my colleague Fulton and the comments that he made there, and just address a couple of the things that you yourself said, Convener. I mean, I think everybody on the committee is at one with the fact that we have to protect freedom of expression, and that's the crux of this bill. the phrase you used, behind closed doors, I'm not sure that I would agree with that. I think the Cabinet Secretary was quite clear and quite open about the fact that he's spoken to party leaders about their amendments, which is normal practice, and there was nothing cloak and dagger about that. And I think he's done it for the right reasons, and I hope that that will lead to consensus, and we do get a good bill. And the only other thing to say about the being so specific, you'll know this, when you start to be very specific about characteristics, you will always get an opposing view. So that doesn't, to me, seem to achieve consensus, and that's really all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rona. I'm going to ask the Cabinet Secretary briefly, if you would, to respond to some of the points that he's heard in this debate, and then I'll ask Liam McArthur formally to wind up. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener, and I can be very brief in this regard. I actually just wanted to touch upon some of the points that you made. I thought all of the contributions that we've heard so far have been extremely helpful, and I really appreciated your own reflections, given your own expertise in the law. And I think this is the difficult balance for all of us to try to get right between stage 2 and stage 3, because we have to recognise that there is an obligation on us to be specific, to be able to provide that clarity, as you said, to come together to find that precision where we possibly can. But we also have to recognise, and this is something I heard really loudly and clearly on Friday when I met with a number of stakeholders, and indeed when I spoke to a number of members across political parties, was that focus, being specific, can also lead to some groups feeling like they're being targeted and marginalised. And how do we get that balance right between saying, actually, you're not being targeted because of who you are, we are trying to create law and give reassurances that are specific. And actually, perhaps by using the wording in Liam McArthur's 103, where it talks about discussion, possibly even we should even think about using the word criticism, because I think it is important in a democracy that people are allowed to criticise. How do we do that in a way that also doesn't make any group feel like they're marginalised or targeted in any way? And perhaps applying that freedom of expression clause to all of the protected characteristics, that is a way of getting around some of the fears that a number of groups have mentioned to me as well. So I take on board your point, Convener. I think you also speak for a number of people who may be concerned about the fact that we're going to withdraw a number of our amendments, but I hope that we take some comfort in what we are saying is that we are going to come back at stage 3 with hopefully a freedom of expression clause that will still be robust, that will still be strong, that will still provide the clarity, the precision that is needed, but hopefully will not target or make any group feel they're being targeted in any way, shape or form. So happy to leave it there, Convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That's a very helpful set of remarks. Could I invite Liam McArthur now formally to wind up this group and to press or withdraw Amendment 103?
Thanks very much, Convener. Yeah, like you, I found not just the Cabinet Secretary's comments there in responding to the debate, but all the contributions to the debate very helpful. I think the Cabinet Secretary is right to remind us that the challenge here is to come up with robust freedom of expression protections, but that avoid either marginalising or targeting particular individual groups. I think John Finney helpfully drew out the concerns around so-called laundry lists in terms of articulating freedom of expression protections, and I think that's why I chose to take a more generalised catch-all approach in Amendment 103. I think Liam Kerr was also right to point to the need for clarity in what's being criminalised, the intention that we all clearly have from the comments we've heard this morning, how that is translated into legal certainty. I'm grateful to Rhoda Grant for helpfully walking through the probing nature of her amendment and her concerns around the admission of sex as an aggravator in this bill. I welcome too Fulton McGregor's support for the approach that's been taken in relation to Amendment 3, albeit that needs to be revised. I think in response to Rona Mackay, I understand I understand her concerns to push back at the notion that somehow this is being carried, the discussions taking place are behind closed doors and somehow not normal practice, or I think cloak and dagger, as she referred to. I don't think there's any suggestion here that that's what was being done over recent times. None of this is unusual in terms of the formulation of approaches where there may be disagreements between individual members of parties on the approach to be taken. I think, however, we're in a different situation at the moment, and the Cabinet Secretary has demonstrably been reaching out to as wide a cross-section of people as he can to see if there's a way forward here, and I commend him again for doing that. I think, though, Convener, you are absolutely right in applying a challenge here, not just in terms of the kind of free speech critique of hate crime laws in terms of their vagueness and the risk of overbreadth, but your challenge to us in adopting the collaborative approach, which we all appear to be signed up to, that this happens in Parliament and in public. I think a way needs to be found to ensure that as we go forward in developing a version of a catch-all freedom of expression amendment that builds on 103, addresses its flaws and deficiencies, I think we will absolutely have to make sure that this is seen as transparent, that it's seen as robust, and it's seen as rigorous for all the reasons that you, Convener, highlighted in terms of the way that this debate is playing out. Again, I appreciate the fact that all members have referred to and have shown strong support for a collaborative approach, but there is a risk in a collaborative approach that, in a sense, it excludes those who are not in the discussion, and I think that's what we need to avoid at all costs. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will have heard that loud and clear through the course of this morning's deliberations, and will be giving active thought to how we avoid that happening. But for the time being, I am content not to move Amendment 103 and commit to working with yourself and other colleagues and the Cabinet Secretary to develop wording that does address the concerns that have been outlined today.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. MacArthur. So Mr. MacArthur has indicated that he wishes to withdraw Amendment 103. Are members content for Amendment 103 to be withdrawn? Members are content. Thank you very much. So we move to the next group on language of statutory aggravations, and I call Amendment 5 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and a group of its own Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to Amendment 5.
Thank you, Convener. I'll speak to Amendment 5 as the only amendment in the group. I recognise the importance of accessibility of language used in legislation. The issue of language within the operation of the statutory aggravators has been discussed throughout the scrutiny process. In this regard, Part 1 of the bill makes provision for the aggravation of offences by prejudice and provides that a criminal offence is aggravated if either the offender evinces malice and ill will towards the victim based on the victim's membership or presumed membership of a group, defined by reference to a listed characteristic, or the offence is motivated wholly or partly by malice and ill will towards any such group. Lord Brackadale, in his final report, recommended updating the language in this area to aid understanding, and this is something I've given very careful consideration to. Importantly, the recommendation by Lord Brackadale was not intended to change the applicable legal threshold, and that's why we took the decision upon introduction of the bill to retain the existing wording, just to provide that reassurance that the current legal threshold would continue to operate. The approach was informed by bodies such as Police Scotland, who stated that any change to the existing wording, specifically malice and ill will, may alter the threshold under which offences aggravated by prejudice are captured. However, I did indicate during my evidence to the Justice Committee a potential compromise would be to partly adjust the language of the threshold by moving to demonstrating malice and ill will. and this is the effect of Amendment 5. It replaces the word evinces with the word demonstrates, so that a criminal offence is aggravated by prejudice if the offender demonstrates malice and ill will towards the victim based on the victim's membership or presumed membership of a group defined by reference to listed characteristics. I'm pleased that this approach has been supported by the committee in its Stage 1 report, which recognises the change and the fact that it aids accessibility of language without having the effect of lowering the current legal threshold, and therefore accordingly I move Amendment 5 in my name.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. No member has indicated yet that they wish to speak in this group, so can I invite you to wind up?
Nothing to add other than, as I say, I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Right, we move to the next group, which is characteristic of age. We'll take the debate on this group and then we'll have a short pause before we move to the group after this. So characteristic of age, I call Amendment 30 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, grouped with Amendments 43, 86, 87 and 99A. I would point out that if Amendment 86 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 87 due to preemption. Margaret Mitchell to move Amendment 30 and speak to all amendments in the group. Margaret.
Thank you, Convener. In brief, the effect of my amendments is as follows. Amendment 30 and 43 remove age from the list of characteristics in the bill. Amendment 86 follows on the basis that if age is removed from the list of characteristics, there's no need for age to be defined under Section 14, meaning of the characteristics. And Amendment 99A removes from the government amendment requirement for age as a characteristic to be captured by reporting. In his review, Lord Brackadale recommended that the Scottish Government should consider the introduction out with the hate crime scheme of a general aggravation covering exploitation and vulnerability. The inclusion of age as a characteristic follows on from his inclusion that there ought to be a new statutory aggregation based on age hostility. However, in his report, for a crime to be considered as aggravated by age hostility, it would need to be proven that the offence was motivated by hostility based on age, or the offender demonstrates hostility towards the victim based on age, during or immediately before or after the commission of the offence. In practice, this is quite a difficult task. In particular, for those crimes committed against the elderly, it will need to be determined that the crime was motivated by hatred of the old as a group and the victim's membership of said group, rather than any desire to exploit the victim's perceived vulnerability because of their age. Here, the Justice Committee noted from the evidence it had received and the conclusion of the research it commissioned that the approach to this issue should be one based on vulnerability, not age. And the committee asked the Cabinet Secretary to set out his plans for dealing with the exploitation of people based on their vulnerability out with this particular bill. So these amendments are probing amendments tabled to give the Cabinet Secretary to the opportunity to do just that. Given the committee referred to the research from Dr. Hannah Bowes of Durham University, who was commissioned by the Justice Committee to examine elderly abuse, she concludes that there is no evidence older people are targeted as victims because they represent the older community. Furthermore, Dr. Bowes notes that there is limited reliable evidence that older people are specifically targeted because of hatred and hostility towards older people. And this is key to our understanding of what is a hate crime. The purpose of hate crime legislation is to distinguish between ordinary crimes as such and those that are motivated by hatred or prejudice towards certain aspects of the victim's identity. Hate crime is therefore characterised by targeting of the victim because of their difference and perceived membership of a particular group towards which the offender is antagonistic. Hence the inclusion of characteristics such as race, disability, or sexual orientation in hate crime legislation. And these are distinct groups of individuals. However, in terms of age, there is recognition that older people are the victims of crime, and there are legitimate concerns about how the criminal justice system currently responds to cases where the victim is elderly. In particular, the low prosecution and conviction rates are very concerning. However, including age as a characteristic in this bill will not address these issues. And here it's been argued that age ought to be included in this bill because other characteristics that are protected by equalities legislation are included for completeness' sake. Therefore, age should also be captured. But equalities legislation serves a different purpose to hate crime legislation. Equalities law aims to prevent discrimination of an individual both in the workplace and wider society based on their protected characteristics. Ensuring that an older person is not discriminated against when it comes to applying for a promotion at work, for example, is not equivalent to someone being assaulted because the offender has a hatred and malicious feelings towards older people as a group. As the Crown and Prosecutorial Service stated, there is this distinction between offences which demonstrate hostility towards someone's age and offences which the accused has exploited, where the accused has exploited someone because of their age and perceived associated vulnerability. The aggravation relating to age in the bill captures the former, hostility, but not the latter, vulnerability. The Law Society have pointed out the difficulty in distinguishing between hostility to someone's age and their perceived vulnerability because of their age. And in addition to this, John Wilkes of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission told the committee, the Commission does not consider that age is a listed characteristic, as it thinks that there should not be sufficient evidence to meet the threshold of statutory aggravation. Convener, just to talk to Amendment 87 in terms of the Cabinet Secretary's amendment here, which amends the wording of Section 14.2 from falling within a range of ages to a range of ages. I agree that this latter wording is clearer. In conclusion, Convener, the inclusion of age as a characteristic in this bill will not serve to address some of the fundamental issues that the justice system faces when the victim of crime is elderly. Furthermore, evidence heard by the committee noted that the lack of clarity on the difference between crimes motivated by hatred of a certain group and taking advantage of someone because of their membership of that group is different. Therefore, age as a characteristic ought not to be included in this bill. Instead, other approaches toward elder abuse and crimes are committed based on an individual's perceived vulnerability outside of legislative change should be considered. I move Amendment 30 in my name.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 87 and other amendments in the group?
Yes, thank you, Convener. The amendments in this group in the name of Margaret Mitchell, when read with Amendment 11 in the name of Liam Kerr, which is in a later group, would remove the characteristic of age from the bill. The bill includes age as an additional characteristic to ensure hate crime legislation provides sufficient protection against offences arising from age-related prejudice. It includes a new statutory aggravation in relation to age, as well as new offences relating to stirring up of hatred based on age. I do believe the inclusion of age as a characteristic within hate crime will send a very clear message to society that these offences will be treated seriously and will not be tolerated. Importantly, the offences cover persons of any age or indeed age range. This means that they do not, for example, apply only to older people or to children and young people, although in practice it may be that where these offences relate to the characteristic of age, they are more likely to be committed against those groups. I also note that during stage 1 scrutiny, the committee heard from Age Scotland and from YouthLink Scotland. Both of these organisations have said that the people they support do feel targeted because of their age, and they support the inclusion of age within the bill. Amendments 30, 43 and 86 would mean removing the protection for those targeted on the basis of their age. Amendment 99A would amend Amendment 99 in my name, which provides for the publication of reports by police on recorded hate crime. Amendment 99A would remove the requirement to report hate crime offences involving age. And while I note the number of prosecutions under this particular characteristic may not be high, I see no reason why that should prevent us from providing this additional protection. I'm also aware of concerns around the need to tackle exploitation and vulnerability as opposed to hate crime based age. I note that Margaret Mitchell in her remarks referenced research by Dr. Hannah Bowes, which explored this matter in depth. However, as outlined in my response to the committee's stage 1 report, the government is committed to considering whether there should be reforms to the criminal law to improve the protection available to people who may be at increased risk of being exploited and becoming victims of crime because of their vulnerability. And that is very distinct from hate crime. It is not mutually exclusive to have age as a characteristic within hate crime law, while separately seeking to introduce at some future date new criminal law in respect to vulnerability, not least because these approaches would be seeking to achieve different policy outcomes. And my belief is that the addition of age would do no harm. That is, for example, to the conversation no doubt we will have later in relation to ASEC aggravator. I see no harm being done, and in fact I note support for the inclusion of age as a characteristic by a number of stakeholders. So I very much consider that the offences in the bill should apply to age in a similar way that they apply to other characteristics. So I'd ask the member not to move amendments 30, 43, 86 and 99A, but if she does, then the members reject those amendments. Amendment 87 in my name is a very minor change to refine the drafting used to define the meaning of age set out in section 14 of the bill, and I hope members will support it.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. No other member has indicated that they wish to speak in this group, so could I invite Margaret Mitchell to wind up, please, and to press or withdraw Amendment 30. Margaret.
Thank you, Convener. I know what the Cabinet Secretary says about the inclusion of age as characteristics sends out a strong message. That's pretty weak reason to include it in the hate crime bill, Cabinet Secretary. It's not a hate crime, it's basically a crime against young and old on a vulnerability basis. And to quote Dr. Hannah Bowes, a research in NEC seeking to recognise and respond to abuse of elderly through age says specific criminal offences or by widening access to hate crime framework to include older age will neither reduce the violence or abuse or improve the prosecution and violence rates. So I'm disappointed the Cabinet Secretary hasn't said more about what the Scottish Government could do specifically to raise awareness and recognition of the exploitation of elderly people, and sometimes very often through scams, younger people based on their vulnerability, and whether in fact there's a need for a holistic approach for work being done by current strategies and wider work on older people, and a broader view of family law affecting older people. And I hope as we move to stage 3, Convener, the Cabinet Secretary will really reflect on these very serious concerns. It would be a tragedy if the government thought it was a done deal. Age has been included in hate crime, walk away and forget, because elderly people and younger people who would be targeted will still be left vulnerable without including the exploitation of vulnerability. I said at the beginning, Convener, that these were probing amendments. Therefore, I will not move Amendment 30.
Thank you very much, Margaret. So Margaret Mitchell seeks to withdraw Amendment 30. Are members content that Amendment 30 be withdrawn? Members are content. Thank you. Before we move to the next group, which is characteristic of sex, we're going to suspend for 5 minutes so that some of us can go and check on our homeschooling children or have a biscuit or a cup of tea. So we'll suspend for 5 minutes, please. Thank you, everyone, and welcome back. And we'll move to our next group, which is on the characteristic of sex. And I call Amendment 31 in the name of Joanne Lamont, grouped with Amendments 89, 93, 95, 96, 97, and 98. Joanne Lamont to move Amendment 31 and to speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Thank you. Can I move the amendment in my name? I have got some problems with the connection, so if people have difficulty following me, my apologies for that. I did in fact send a letter out to the committee, and I hope that has proven useful in providing the detailed thinking behind this amendment. It wants to include sex, well, use the definition of sex currently in the Act. Fundamental point.
Joanne, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can we please move Joanne Lamont to audio only, because I'm struggling to hear her, and I understand that her connection will be improved if we have audio only for Joanne Lamont. So can we make that change, please? Because we do need to be able to hear the arguments that she's making. Thank you.
My apologies. My apologies, and I do hope the letter does provide the detail if the connection breaks up again. But it's a fundamental point, in my view. If we are seeking to produce legislation that addresses behaviour motivated by hate, it is essential that we address the hatred that blights the lives of women, a group which is, of course, in the majority, but does not stop misogyny surfacing. And I was very struck by the sense that earlier, the anxiety of the committee to find consensus, to be clear about how we treat particular groups. But this bill excludes women whose lives, most women understand the experience of misogyny in their lives. And that, of course, is not a controversial or a disputed point. And indeed, those who are arguing against including sex as a characteristic in the bill are explicit in recognising this reality for women. And I think this is a matter for us as legislators. I note that the working group has been established. I think they can do an important job, but they are not a substitute for a decision in primary legislation to include women. My amendment includes sex as a characteristic, recognising it can be a motivator in a hate crime. It does not preclude the working group from doing its job. As I've said, the group can address any potential challenges that might bring, how to improve the position, and indeed could propose a standalone legislation if it saw fit. But at the moment, women are excluded, and I don't think that that is acceptable. Now, there's a number of arguments being made on which the government has relied from Engender and the group round about them. And of course, these groups should be treated with respect, and what they have to say is important. But it's that there are other groups, there are other academics, there are women's organisations, and indeed, over a long period of time, women's groups have argued that hatred of women, misogyny, should be recognised in law. This is not something new. And I want to just briefly touch on some of the arguments that have been made against it. It is said that we don't want simply to have a panacea, that we need more than this, we would need education, that we need more than simply a signal. But in fact, that is true of all of the characteristics that are currently included in the legislation. And it would seem that women are unique, that they have not even to have a signal, because none of this legislation will work unless it's included in education and public awareness and so on. But the truth is, currently, a position would be government would invest in education and public awareness, and women's experience would not be part of that conversation. There is also an argument, and I understand this argument, that this could be manipulated by abusers of women. Now, this has always been the case. If we were stopped from legislating because abusive men would manipulate the legislation against women, we would not have legislated on stalking, on sexual assault, on domestic abuse, or on coercive control. And I do think there may be a job for the working group to look at the way in which legislation can be used, abuser against abused, and I would argue that, in fact, that may be the case in other characteristics too. The point is made that we don't want to use gender-neutral language. We should be naming the crime. And I have got very strong recognition of that we should be talking about male violence against women and so on. However, the same groups have applauded the Domestic Abuse Act as world leading, and that uses neutral language, and indeed the Cabinet Secretary already in the discussion round age makes that point about the way in which you don't you describe the characteristic, and that enables us to have the legislation. There's also a point that women are not a minority, and therefore people find uncomfortable to have legislation for women because they're not a minority. I think that should give us even greater pause and greater thought that this should be included, because we are still women are still abused despite being the majority, and of course this is not just within local communities but globally. I do think it's important to understand the experience of misogyny, and it should therefore be in primary legislation, decided democratically, and of course that's what Lord Bracondale himself argued, as did other witnesses. And it's clear that women are included. They've become more visible in public policy, in data gathering, in understanding the experience of women, and the way it's experienced in the justice system. We shouldn't be afraid of gathering that information and understanding better what women's lives are. And I'll finish on a last couple of points, and I appreciate the convener has been very generous with my time. The Law Society makes an important point, I think, when they talked about the importance of education and public awareness campaigns. If we're going to have this legislation at all, it can't simply be a signal. But it's, as the bill currently stands, as I already said, hatred of women would be absent from that discussion. We cannot afford to have that discussion excluded because it affects so many women and girls. And there has been no explanation that I find compelling, no risk that comes from including women at this stage, but in fact treats them with respect. If we accept that women's lives are shaped and limited by misogyny and hatred, we should be clear that it's unacceptable. And indeed, as more groups have been identified and named in the legislation, the absence of women becomes harder to understand. And I hope the committee will recognise that this is not about making lives more difficult, that we have got the provision of the working group that can look at some of the concerns that have been expressed. It's a fundamental reality of women's lives that they experience hatred, and for a hate crime bill to exclude that group doesn't seem to me to be in any way understandable. For whatever the weaknesses of the legislation may be, these weaknesses apply to all characteristics, and I believe very strongly that women should be included, and I hope the committee will agree with me. Thank you, convener.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and I'm sorry we weren't able to see you, but we caught that, I think, clearly in terms of what you were saying to us. Annabel Ewing, Rhoda Grant, John Finney, Liam Kerr and Liam MacArthur all want to come in and contribute to this debate, and I'll call them in due course. But first I need to call the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 95 and other amendments in this group.
Thank you very much, convener, and can I thank Joanne Lamont for her remarks. Clearly, I think it's important to recognise Joanne Lamont's contribution and I think lifelong effort. I would expect to equality for women, but equality more broadly across the board. And I hope that despite the fact that I'm going to disagree with her in relation to her amendments, that she wouldn't cast any doubt on our motivations in terms of equality for women and indeed equality right across the board. As I've stated throughout the scrutiny of this bill, convener, the Scottish Government recognises the importance of tackling misogyny and all forms of gender-based violence in Scotland. That's evident through our work to implement the Equally Safe strategy and take forward recommendations from the First Women's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls. We understand the significance of how this type of behaviour can limit women and girls' space for action, and we want to address that. However, I also know that there are strong, sometimes quite diverging views on how this important matter should be tackled. Joanne Lamont's amendments would see the characteristic of sex added to the list of characteristics in section 1 of the bill. and add provision to define sex, and they would consequently remove the power to make these additions by regulation at a later date. I know that on the surface this seems appealing. Including sex in Scotland's hate crime framework would make it clear that offences aggravated by malice and ill will towards individuals based on their sex is unacceptable and subject to sanction by the criminal law. Some of the witnesses the committee heard at stage 1 also initially favoured this, but a number of them have also then gone on to change their minds once more evidence has been heard. And that additional evidence has persuaded me, I know it's persuaded some members of the committee, that this is an issue that needs further expert examination. Convener, it's my view that the issue of misogyny is far bigger than the hate crime framework. This government has put on record our belief that work should be done to explore a standalone offence of misogyny, and indeed Baroness Helena Kennedy's working group will examine and explore this very matter. If adding a sex aggravator was a neutral act, then I would have no hesitation in supporting it. However, it must be recognised that a number of experts with years, decades of pedigree and expertise in this area have provided evidence that such an aggravator could in fact do harm to women. In particular, a number of national organisations with expertise in tackling misogyny and violence against women, including Engender, Scottish Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Scotland and Zero Tolerance, have all warned of potential harms and unintended consequences flowing from the inclusion of sex within the hate crime framework. And that harm would be, again, to women. We heard about these concerns directly during the oral evidence session during the committee stage 1 session. Included the potential for an expected low level of prosecutions to mask the true extent of misogyny that exists across our society, but also importantly that domestic abuse perpetrators may use the threat of criminality and a gender neutral aggravator as part of a wider pattern of coercive control over women. Above all, I do not want to legislate for something that has not been fully considered and that could have potentially detrimental impacts in tackling the very real consequences of violent and oppressive misogyny. The bill therefore proposes a different approach. At present, Section 15 contains an enabling power to allow for the characteristic of sex to be added to the bill at a later date. The rationale for including this enabling power was closely tied to the creation of the working group. The working group will consider how the criminal law deals with serious misogyny and misogynistic acts. They will also consider whether to use the bill's power at Section 15 to add the characteristic of sex to the hate crime legislative framework. Assembling a group with significant level of expertise and granting them the time to consider relevant evidence and data will allow for us to be presented with a set of robust conclusions on how we best tackle misogyny within the Scottish context. Their conclusion may well come back that a sex aggravator is an important tool. If that is the case, then the government will of course give that recommendation consideration and if necessary of course bring forward or trigger the enabling power which is that is in the bill, or will be, I hope, in the bill after stage 2 proceedings. This is a unique way forward, one that provides the best approach to help shape society to allow women and girls to live their lives free from harassment and abuse. Towards the end of the year, I was delighted to announce Baroness Kennedy's appointment as the chair of the working group. I note that the committee's own Stage 1 report recommends that MSPs wait until the working group has reported before Parliament considers legislating to add sex as a hate crime characteristic. I strongly agree with that approach taken. In response to the call from parliamentarians to take this work forward at pace, Baroness Kennedy confirmed yesterday that she has agreed to meet the 12-month deadline recommended by the Justice Committee in its Stage 1 report. This means that the working group is committed to delivering its findings within 12 months. I hope that gives comfort to anybody who feels that this issue is being kicked into the long grass. It is not. There will be a recommendation, one way or another, after expert advice and analysis on whether a sex aggravator should be added via the enabling power in the bill to the bill. It is for these reasons that I ask members to give the working group the time it needs, time to scrutinise the data and evidence on misogyny in Scotland, time to test the ability of the criminal law to respond to these problems, and time to work through whether or not a sex aggravator could unintentionally do harm to women. And if we give them that time, I believe their report will be substantial and informative. And I would ask members to therefore vote against the amendments in the name of Joanne Lamont. The amendments in this group in my name will adjust the enabling power so that it can also be used to modify other provisions of the bill in the event that the characteristic of sex is added to the hate crime legislation framework in the future. Amendment 96 would allow future regulations to make provisions for the data reporting requirements, which are proposed adding to the bill by a separate amendment. Amendment 98 would ensure that we strengthen, in response to the Stage 1 report, strengthen the procedure which applies to regulations which enable sex to be added, so the power is subject to a form of a super affirmative procedure. And Amendment 95 makes provision to allow protection of freedom of expression provisions to be added to the bill for the characteristic of sex. This provision would provide flexibility to allow freedom of expression provisions to be included or not by means of regulation made under Section 15, as well as the flexibility to determine how these freedom of expression clauses should be framed. However, obviously in light of previous discussions on the general approach to freedom of expression in the bill, at this stage I'll not move Amendment 95 to allow members to work collaboratively together to achieve the most effective protections for consideration at Stage 3. I therefore encourage members to support Amendment 96 and 98 in my name.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And as indicated, a number of members have indicated their desire to participate in the debate on this group. And I call first Annabel Ewing, and after that, Annabel Ewing v Rhoda Grant. Annabel.
Thank you, Convener. During the Stage 1 debate on this bill on 15th of December last year, I made a number of points on the matter, which I would wish briefly to reiterate. First, the genesis of this bill has nothing to do with the current debate on the immutability of sexual dimorphism and the importance of not conflating sex and gender. I know because I was the junior minister in the Justice team who commissioned the Lord Brackadale to conduct the review on hate crime legislation. Second, the approach being proposed by the Scottish Government reflects indeed a long-standing debate about the best way to tackle misogyny against women because of their sex. The debate on whether that is by a symmetrical approach, an approach which patently has failed to date, or rather whether there should be a presumption against gender-neutral laws as set forth in the Istanbul Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. Given the scale of the problem affecting women, I have been persuaded on the basis of the evidence submitted to the committee that a wider reflection on this issue is long overdue. And in that regard, I have been reassured by the statement from the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service to the effect that in the absence of a specific sex aggravator in the meantime, that will not prevent prosecutions taking place. Third, I therefore welcome the Baroness Helena Kenny working group, which is to be set up to look in detail at this issue. I note the calibre and expertise of the newly announced membership of the working group, and I'm very pleased indeed to note that the Baroness has confirmed that the working group will conclude its work within 12 months, an issue I certainly pressed for in committee and was very pleased to receive committee support and indeed I believe Scottish Government support for that. In conclusion, Convener, given the working group is to have its first meeting, I believe, next week, I believe that we should allow it to conduct its work, its vitally important work, and not seek to preempt the outcome of that work so that we can reach a point where women cannot be attacked with impunity because of their sex. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Annabel. I call Rhoda Grant to be followed by John Finney, please. Rhoda.
Thank you, Convener. I support Joanne Lamont's amendment for the same reasons as I spoke in support and explanation of my own amendments. She also made the point that violence against women is men's violence against women, and it's very important that we understand that as part of legislation. I support the setting up of the working group, and indeed I look forward to their findings. But the problem still remains that women do not have any protection until that happens. They're being left out of this hate crime bill. The Cabinet Secretary said, and I also welcome that they will report quickly, they'll report within 12 months. But he cannot, while they can guarantee to report within 12 months, he cannot guarantee that what they report on and their findings will be legislated on. So I would be more comfortable with sex being added to the bill with the provisions to remove it and replace it after the misogyny working group had reported, rather than the other way around, because I really do believe that that leaves a gap in this legislation and a gap in protection for women. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Rhoda. So I call next John Finney, please, and after John Finney, be Liam Kerr. John.
Thank you, Convener. I have just a few months to go in my parliamentary stint, and I think at no time previously I've been so aware of the idea of sides. Whose side are you on? Let me say I'm on the side of good law. I'm on the side of informed lawmaking. I think that's very important. Now, Joanne Lamont talked about domestic violence. I have a declaration to make here. I'm an office bearer on the cross-party group of Men's Violence Against Women and Girls. The title of that group is very, very important. I say again, Men's Violence Against Women and Girls. Very, very important. Language is important. We discussed that earlier. That, of course, doesn't mean that that's exclusively who the victims are, but it's overwhelmingly the case. And it's overwhelmingly the case because we still live in a deeply flawed patriarchal society. The other thing that Joanne talked about was the controlling and coercive behaviour. And I think we rightly are proud of that. And we're proud of that because that's a very challenging concept to deal with. And that was dealt with. And it's very important that the training that followed that recognises the role that men's controlling behaviour has in our society. So this is a piece of legislation that's fundamentally about consolidation. It's also about some expansion. And I think our report was very clear on this. And I think it was in November of last year, the committee welcomed the appointment of Dame Helena Kennedy. Was it yesterday or the day before that we learned the composition of the task force to consider whether misogynistic behaviour should be a standalone offence in Scots law? I think if for 1 second I thought this was a version of long grass presented to us by the Scottish Government, then I might take a different approach to this. But I think, and I would ask Joanne to reflect whether having engaged in the membership of that committee is impressive, with a very impressive leader. We were all delighted to know that it was Dame Helena Kennedy that was leading it. I think it would be inappropriate to cross that work. There's important work to be done, and I think that will be reflected in legislative changes in due course. This is not the time. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you very much, Mr. Finney. I call now Liam Kerr, and after Liam Kerr, it will be Liam MacArthur, please. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Convener, I wasn't set on speaking to this group today, but I will do so as I think members will know this is an issue that's played on my mind from the start, much as it has in the minds of my colleagues on the committee. As members know from my contributions in committee and the debates, I've always started from a position that there should be an aggravator for sex. And as Joanne Lamont put it, women should be included. I regret that this was not included at the outset, and I fear greatly, much as I think John Finney just alluded to, that this issue could be kicked into the long grass. Annabel Ewing said this is a long-standing debate. and it does seem to be, which worries me greatly. I think that for completeness, I received Joanne Lamont's letter recently articulating why she feels her amendments should be included today, and I did find it a very persuasive argument. I think she argued her case well, and I thought she spoke well today. The key question throughout all of this that I've asked myself is along the lines of, why not just do this? Where is the prejudice if we put the protection in unless and until the working group reports? I think I heard Rhoda Grant saying, making a similar proposition, but I think I come to a different conclusion because I heard evidence in the committee about where the prejudice might be, which made me pause a little. But again, just for completeness, I think the member, Joanne Lamont, argued coherently why we should prefer her side. But crucially, in my mind, we received a briefing from the Law Society of Scotland, of which I remind colleagues that I'm a member, and which Joanne Lamont referred to. Now, in Joanne Lamont's submission, she said there is no risk to including women at this stage. But the Law Society note said, in relation to this proposal, and I quote, any substantial change to the list of aggravations should be subject to robust scrutiny. And I think they are right. We should have had that opportunity, but disappointingly, it has not been afforded to us. And now we cannot so subject it at this stage. It is disappointing, but it is the reality. Like others who have contributed today, I am reassured by the news that the working group has been constituted, and I am reassured, and I'm particularly pleased that they've set a time frame of, I think, 12 months on when they will report. Now, that gives me comfort that this isn't going to be kicked into the long grass. I'm disappointed because I think I would have preferred to be sitting in a different position today, or I know I would, but we are where we are, and for these reasons, and only after very deep reflection, I would vote against Joanne Lamont's amendments today.
Thank you, Liam. And I now ask Liam MacArthur. Please, Liam.
Thanks very much, Convener. A little like John Finney, let me start with a declaration as the recently appointed ambassador to the newly established White Ribbon Scotland Orkney organisation, which I am pleased to say is going from strength to strength here in the islands. A bit like Liam Kerr, not only can I understand the anxiety underlying Joanne Lamont's Amendment 31, and again, I thank her for the information she provided ahead of this morning's committee session. But it's very much the position I held at the outset of the scrutiny process. This bill appears, in the face of it, to be the perfect opportunity to create a legislative tool to deal with the vile misogyny that remains all too prevalent in our society. The exodus of women from public office in the run-up to the 2019 general election, for example, it's said to have been largely motivated by disgraceful online vitriol, reinforced the clear and pressing need for more to be done to tackle misogynistic harassment. A problem obviously not confined to the world of politics, and one that all too often blights the lives and life chances of women and girls in this country. Tackling this robustly and with urgency is an aim to which Scottish Liberal Democrats are wholly committed. Having sat through the evidence we heard at stage one, however, I'm broadly persuaded by the calls made by a variety of equality organisations for this to be done in a holistic way that recognises the full extent of misogynistic behaviours. Moreover, I believe the group assembled and chaired by Helena Kennedy is equipped to carry out this task in a thorough and inclusive manner. That said, while I support the establishment of this group, I share the concerns I think a number of us feel about how realistic it is to expect the group to produce recommendations within a year. Indeed, even if this heroically optimistic timeframe is met, there are also, I think, legitimate concerns about the scope available to Parliament to scrutinise effectively those recommendations. I look forward to hearing what the Cabinet Secretary will have to say on that point, but meantime, I thank Joanne Lamont for bringing forward her amendment, allowing this question to be debated at stage two. They'll confirm that I'll not be supporting Amendment 31 this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Liam. Rona Mackay and Shona Robertson have both indicated that they'd like to participate in this debate. So could I call Rona Mackay first, please, and then after Rona it will be Shona. Rona.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I mean, I'll be very brief because we've had some very good contributions there, and I just wanted to say a few words. I'd like to thank Joanne Lamont for bringing this forward too, and I have, huge sympathy and understanding for what she's saying, and she puts her case forward very, very well. Just also to say that, I mean, I'm one of the conveners of the Men's Violence Against Women and Girls group, so this means a lot to me. I think on balance, due to the evidence that we heard, I won't be supporting this for reasons that have been already articulated. I won't go over them again. But just to say that I think Joanne said in her speech that it wasn't even being discussed. I think it may not be part of the bill at this stage. I think it is being discussed, in the setting up of the working group shows you just how seriously this matter has been taken. I mean, it's it's standing alone, if you like, in that this eminent working group has been put up to look at this whole issue, because misogyny has been with us forever, and it seems to be getting worse, and this will hopefully show us the way forward. So I would rather let the group do their scrutiny within a year, and then we'll see what comes out of that. And that would be the only reason that I'm not supporting it at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I call Shona Robertson, please, and then after Shona Robertson, it'll be Fulton. Shona.
Thanks, Convener. I'll be brief as well. I mean, having spent my whole life fighting misogyny and as a feminist, I think we all want the same outcome here. It's about how to get the best outcome. If I thought for a minute that this amendment would solve the problem of misogyny in Scotland and beyond, then I would support it, but it's more complex than that. And having taken and listened to the evidence and heard the evidence that this committee has heard over the last few weeks and months, it is certainly a complex issue, which is why the working group has been established, because I want us to look at the issue of misogyny, not just in relation to this piece of legislation, but across the criminal justice system. And as I understand it, the actual working group is on misogyny and the criminal justice system in Scotland, and to look at how the whole system deals with misogyny. So far from the kicking this into the long grass, I think this is an opportunity to look at the whole issue across our criminal justice system and how best to ensure that women are afforded the protection that they should have. I think what we need to hear from the Cabinet Secretary is reassurances that as soon as this working group reports that action will be taken on the recommendations that it brings forward, because I, for one, want to make sure that action happens at the earliest opportunity from the report of this very eminent group. And I think Helena Kennedy and her colleagues will do a good job on this matter, and something that we can all agree on. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Shona. And can I now call Fulton McGregor, please?
Thanks, Convener. I'll also be very brief and just want to echo the comments made by Kai and Shona Robinson just before me. Firstly, obviously, to say thanks to Joanne Lamont for bringing forward this amendment, and also for our work in this area. I've got to know Joanne over the last few years, sitting cross-party groups together, and I know how passionate a campaigner she is on this and many other issues, particularly children affected by childhood sexual abuse, and I want to thank her for that and this amendment. I hopefully can reassure Joanne, and I know that she'll know this, but the committee did discuss this particular issue at length. It was probably one of the most discussed topics through the stage one, discussed areas through stage one, and it is very important that we get it right. The evidence that we heard from women's organisations, was finely balanced. We heard that actually bringing forward an amendment like this might not help women, but we also heard the contrary evidence. And I think that in our stage one report demonstrates that we come down quite strongly in the belief that the working group that's been set up should be allowed to do its work and bring back a recommendation. And we've all got a lot of faith in that working group, as other members have said. And it's for those reasons that I wouldn't support this amendment at this stage. However, I think, like everybody else, I very much see the merit in it, and I'm looking forward to hearing how the working group progresses this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fulton. A couple of points made by members in the course of this debate were directed to the Cabinet Secretary. So could I ask him very briefly, if he would please, to respond to those points before I invite Joanne Lamont to wind up this debate. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Happy to, Convener. I think the central point put forward by a number of committee members, including those of my own party, was to seek an assurance from the government that if the recommendation of the working group, which is to report within 12 months of its first meeting, is that there should be the inclusion of a sex aggravator, and that is its firm and unanimous view, then the inclusion of a sex aggravator would happen, and I would commit to that. And again, of course, on the basis that there is an enabling power, that is now a super affirmative procedure. So I'm happy to give that absolute reassurance. Slightly disturbed at the amount of members who believe the government would kick things into long grass, but I hope you have been given an assurance that the 12-month timescale means that there is no kicking this issue down the road at all, and I look forward to the expert deliberations of Baroness Kennedy's working group.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I think long grass is getting a very bad name in this debate, but can I invite Joanne Lamont formally to wind up this debate, please, and to press or withdraw Amendment 31. Joanne.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to committee members for the seriousness with which they have listened to what I've said and responded to it. I don't agree with what the committee members have said, but I respect that this is something that people have thought about, and so it is not with disrespect that I would argue still that this needs to be in the bill. The Cabinet Secretary says if the group decides that there should be a sex aggravator, we would respond to that. Frankly, I think it's a matter for legislators to decide that. And I think we have seen elsewhere where there's been complexities of the legislation dealing with different groups. The committee has been clear that they need to sort it, address it, and come together to do so. And I'm asking no more than that for women as well. It's already been clear that this is a finely balanced argument, and that the government in particular has weighed the evidence and has taken what in Gender, Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Women's Aid and Zero Tolerance have said. They've taken that and weighed that evidence more strongly than the evidence against that. I don't accept that there has not been scrutiny of this. Clearly, Lord Brackadale made a recommendation in favour of including, he called it sex, but clearly it would be sex. Academics and women's groups argued for it to be included. This is not something new. It's been a live issue in the Parliament. Goodness, when I was a government minister back in 2004, these are arguments that we have wrestled with over a long period of time. So the argument of lack of scrutiny simply doesn't hold. People are making a judgment on the evidence. Now, I have great respect for the national organisations that have argued this case, but I think I've at least made a serious effort in arguing why I think they are, on balance, are not right in this regard. On the question of the gender neutral language, the Equality Act and the Domestic Abuse Act, which is regarded as world leading, both use the language that I'm proposing. So it doesn't affect our ability to tackle violence against women to use this term. The groups say that there is evidence that this could be used against women, but have not provided that evidence. But even if it were the case, then that would logically mean that we cannot legislate on these matters at all because of manipulative abusers. This was, people have referred to the fact that I've been involved in these arguments for a long time. It's not that long ago that we were told that domestic abuse was not a matter for the courts, wasn't a matter for legislation, wasn't a matter of public interest, it was a private matter. We disagreed with that and we showed that that could be done. I feel very strongly that sometimes when you say something out loud, there is a common sense reaction to it that we should listen to. We are putting forward, or we've been asked to accept a proposal at the moment that the Scottish Parliament wants to address hate in our society targeted at particular groups. But we want to exclude women from that legislation, despite the fact that all the evidence shows that women experience misogyny and hatred in their lives at a level that everybody accepts is very serious. Now, if we accept that women experience hate in their lives, which damages their opportunities, that for some people, for some young women, denies them the ability to achieve their potential, we are saying there's not a place in this legislation for women. And I think when you say that out loud, that common sense argument is irrefutable. There are weaknesses and limitations in the legislation, but these weaknesses and limitations apply to all of the characteristics that are being identified. And I do think that there is nobody wants to create harm for anyone. So all of this legislation, in whatever way it is taken forward, we would be applying the same effect. It's not, the case has not been made why women should be excluded from legislation that seeks to understand the motivations behind crimes, understand hatred and address it. And not just address it in the criminal courts, but address it through education and public awareness. It is, what I am proposing is that sex is included as a characteristic, and if there are problems with that for particular offences, that the working group could address that problem. Now, I accept that at this stage I have not persuaded all of the committee in this, and I would not intend pressing my amendments at this stage, but I would be looking for strong reassurances from, and I expect I will bring this back at stage 3, but we need strong reassurances about the transparency of the working group, who's going to be on the working group, and that they will be charged with the responsibility, not of simply looking at it, but looking at what would be the weaknesses of including sex as a characteristic. So we would not be asking them whether it should be included, but show why not, or show what needs to be done to make sure there's a protection. That might be a position that the group could be looking at. So I'm not talking about long grass here. This is an issue that's exercised women and women's groups and women's organisations who currently are campaigning on this matter for many, many years. And in the common sense view of this, there is no explanation being given that why women who daily experience hatred are not included in legislation which is wanting to give people further protections and to educate people about the corrosive nature of hatred in people's behaviour. So as I've said, I don't intend to press at this stage, but I will be bringing this back at stage 3 because I think this is a matter that needs to be democratically decided, and then working groups or whatever can work on the detail of it. But I do business with which people have addressed this, but I would ask in conclusion that you think about how you would answer the question. If you have hate crime legislation to protect groups who are vulnerable, why are women not included? And if we can't answer that question, then I think we should be looking to include the amendment at the next stage in the consideration of this legislation. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Joanne. So Joanne Lamont wishes to withdraw Amendment 31. Are members content that Amendment 31 be withdrawn? Members are content. Thank you. So we move to the next group, which is characteristic of transgender identity. I call Amendment 104 in the name of Liam Kerr, grouped with Amendments 107, 109, 113 and 114. And I would point out that if Amendment 15 in the group Stirring Up Hatred Offences Characteristics is agreed, I will not be able to call Amendment 107. Liam Kerr to move Amendment 104 and to speak to all amendments in the group, please, Mr. Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. This section of amendments are grouped as characteristic of transgender identity. And what I'm really seeking in what are probing amendments is the clarity that we were all discussing earlier. As I said earlier, my whole approach to this bill, as I think with my colleagues, is simply that if the government is going to legislate, it has a duty to make absolutely clear, without ambiguity, to whom that legislation applies and to whom it protects. Now, pretty much all of my amendments to this bill start from that position. Try to make this bill as tightly drafted as it can be, so we not only protect those people whom the bill seeks to protect, but also we don't inadvertently create grey areas and uncertainty. Now, a core principle of any law is that it must be comprehensible for those who are subject to it, the ordinary citizens, if you like. They must understand the scope of the law in order that they can take all appropriate actions to remain within it. And this is the issue that I seek to probe the Cabinet Secretary on. I don't know where to find a definition of transgender identity. I cannot find the definition of a non-binary person. Indeed, the Scottish Government responded to a Freedom of Information request, I believe, by saying, quote, the Scottish Government does not have an official definition of non-binary. Now, during the Stage 1 debate on this bill, the Cabinet Secretary, when talking about any future statutory aggravator aimed at protecting women under hate crime law, said that it would need to align to the protected characteristic of sex within the Equality Act 2010. And I think there's sense in that, and for the same reason, I'm probing the reasons why this bill wouldn't align the definition of transgender identity in the bill with the definition gender reassignment that is used in the 2010 Equality Act. Because it seems to me that doing so would just add clarity to the legislation, because we'll be able to point to a clear definition of who the legislation is trying to protect. Now, it may be that actually the intention of the legislation is to go beyond the definition in the Equality Act. And that's perfectly within the compass of the Cabinet Secretary's remit, is legislation, if you like. But once passed, people need to be clear on that. So if that's right, then I ask, through these probing amendments, for the Cabinet Secretary to clarify to whom precisely he is seeking to extend the protection of the criminal law, and confirm that those groups are not covered by the definition in the defined terms in the Equality Act. Thank you, Convener.
Liam, John Finney has indicated that he'd like to speak in the debate on this group, so can I call Mr. Finney, please?
Excuse me. Thank you very much indeed, Convener, and members are all cited on the Equality Network briefing, and particularly in relation to this, I probably do no better than quote it verbatim. We strongly disagree with the amendments in this group and ask members to reject by replacing, quote, transgender identity, end quote, with, quote, gender reassignment, quote, amendments. Amendments 104, 107, 109 and 113 would change the terminology that's been in use for 10 years under the existing statutory aggravation legislation. Now, we're also told that, of course, this is something that police and other parts of the criminal justice system are familiar with, and there haven't been any connections with. Concerns expressed about by these organisations. We can turn to Amendment 114. It would remove protection from crimes targeted at non-binary people and cross-dressing people. 10 years in existence for the law. So this is both regressive and actually offensive. And I sincerely hope that whilst I get that Mr. Kerr's wanting to probe, as he would say, and generate some discussion on this, I sincerely hope he doesn't press these amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Rhoda Grant, please. Rhoda.
Just a very quick intervention. I agree with what John Finney said, but also the amendments would probably take out of the scope of the bill people who were transitioning, because gender reassignments take an awful long time to happen, and that is a complaint that is often heard from the transgender community, that their waiting lists are overly long. and therefore if they're not in the protection of the legislation while they wait, I think they would have just cause to complain about the lengths of wait that they have to face.
Thank you, Rhoda. No other member has indicated that they wish to participate in the debate on this group, so can I call the Cabinet Secretary, please, to respond to what he's heard? Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. The set of amendments, as we've heard, seeks to remove the term transgender identity from the bill and replace it with the term gender reassignment. This would also limit the protections provided within the bill to male to female transgender people and female to male transgender people, excluding non-binary people and cross-dressers. I recognise that the term gender reassignment is used in the Equality Act 2010, as Liam Kerr points out. However, it is important to note that the Equality Act and this bill serve very different purposes, and in this instance, these amendments would have an adverse effect on the clear and inclusive definition currently used and proposed within the bill for hate crime purposes. I'm aware of suggestions that the only reason cross-dressers are included in the bill's definition of transgender identity is because they are protected in the current legislation. Now, while this is a key and very important point, they're also included because there's evidence to suggest they experience hate crime. The Equality Network, and I think the briefing was already referenced to by John Finney, they've provided some examples of this. One of those examples is that a man who is not a trans woman but wears a dress for, say, a drag performance, for example, could be at high risk of transphobic hate crime. They go on to add that this is very likely that a perpetrator could later claim that they have no issue with trans women, quote unquote, who are really transitioning, and only had a problem with, again, quote unquote, men dressing up as women without transitioning. To me, therefore, it is clear that prejudice can be based on the fact a person cross-dresses, not just because they are trans, or based on the presumption that they are trans. It's therefore essential that cross-dressing people continue to be protected within this bill. The use of up-to-date and inclusive language is an important overall objective in updating and modernising hate crime legislation. I've sought to ensure that where possible, the language used is simple and understood by stakeholders and the general public. These amendments lack clarity, they would be damaging to non-binary people, and they would seek to remove people who cross-dress that are currently protected by current legislation, and they would significantly limit the express protections that the bill currently affords them. The government remains committed to improving the lives of trans people, including non-binary people. Not only transgender-related hate crime as being a significant issue that needs tackled, but we know that trans people continue to suffer poorer outcomes relative to the wider population. This needs to change. These amendments would hopefully, these amendments, if they were supported, would take us in the wrong direction. I hope Liam Kerr will not press these amendments. I think he suggested they were probing amendments, and hopefully with the other provisions within this bill, we can help to improve the outcomes for trans people.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Could I invite Liam Kerr to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 104, please, Mr. Kerr?
Thank you, Convener, and I'm grateful to all members for their contribution to the debate. This was very much something that was brought up by witnesses to the committee, and I think it is important that it's examined, and I think it's important that it's on the record, the contributions that members have made. Particularly important, I think, is the Cabinet Secretary's winding up at the end there. This is about clarification, it is about protecting people, and I think this has been a good debate. So I can confirm that it is not my intention to press Amendment 104 or any of the others in the group. We've had the debate, and I think it was a valuable one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kerr. So Liam Kerr has indicated that he wishes to withdraw Amendment 104. Are members content that Amendment 104 be withdrawn? Members are content. Thank you. So we move to the next group, which is on characteristic of variations in sex characteristics. I call Amendment 105 in the name of Liam Kerr, grouped with Amendments 106, 108, 110, 111, 115 and 116. There are a number of preemptions in this group that I need to point out. If Amendment 105 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 106. If Amendment 16 in group stirring up hatred offences characteristics is agreed, I cannot call Amendment 108. If Amendment 110 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 111. And if Amendment 115 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 116. And there will be a test on that later to make sure you are paying attention. In the meantime, can I ask Liam Kerr to move Amendment 105 and to speak to all amendments in the group, please, Mr. Kerr?
All of us on this committee recognise that this is a sensitive area. Indeed, our report says, quote, "This is an exceptionally sensitive matter," end quote, on which I do not claim, I certainly don't claim any expertise. The committee's report asked Parliament to reflect on this area carefully as the bill is debated further, and I seek with these amendments to give the committee that opportunity. The reason for my tabling the amendments relating to the deletion of the section is very much to probe the government's rationale for adding variations in sex characteristics as a statutory aggravator. Now, as I understand it, the term refers to a set of around 40 conditions that affect the development of the reproductive organs and genitals. There seems to be a general acceptance that it was inappropriate to have grouped those with other characteristics in the 2009 Act, hence the creation and addition of a new protected characteristic. Now, I do note the terminology is contested. At stage 1, we heard from DSD families who favour the term differences of sex development, the term apparently used by NHS clinicians. In the 2009 Act, the term was intersexuality, more commonly understand intersex. So my probing amendment simply asks the Cabinet Secretary to set out his case for the inclusion of this characteristic, bearing in mind the evidence we heard from DSD families. In evidence to the committee, they said, quote, "If the government is determined to add VSC to the hate crime bill, we would urge them to provide a clear definition of what conditions they cover, an evidence base for the sort of hate crime they believe people may experience, and the reason why this is not the same for anyone else with more readily obvious body difference," end quote. Similarly, I listened to the representative of DSD families at stage 1, and in particular their concern that being included could be stigmatising. Their written response states, "Singling out a biological condition in this way reinforces stigma rather than working towards understanding and societal acceptance." And really, I'd be very keen to hear what the Cabinet Secretary and my fellow committee members think on this. Now, in relation to the amendments changing the definition, we're looking to change variations in sex characteristics to differences in sex development. And convener, in passing, I note the typo in Amendment 116, which, if passed, I'll correct at stage 3. Again, this goes back to my earlier group. I simply seek absolute precision in the language of the law so everyone knows precisely what is being talked about. Now, responding to a parliamentary question I lodged last summer, the Cabinet Secretary replied that variations in sex characteristics had been used as this is an inclusive term increasingly being adopted by stakeholders. So I think the first question is really whether those stakeholders include, and indeed the consultation was with NHS clinicians who work with those with these characteristics, not least because I see that the NHS refers to differences of sex development and gives a definition. So one would have thought consistency and clarity would suggest following that. And convener, I'd be grateful for the Cabinet Secretary's thoughts and those of the committee in relation to these amendments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liam. John Finney has indicated that he'd like to speak in this group, so can I call John Finney, please?
Thank you, convener. And yes, I didn't hear Mr. Kerr mention the Klinefelter Syndrome Association UK and the Adult Support Coordinator at the CAH support group. It's clear that there's a measure of discomfort from some people discussing these issues. What I want to have is legislation that's inclusive and covering everyone. Now, the concerns were voiced by both these associations about 106, 108, 111 and 116, these amendments. And I would hope, and once again we are with a probing amendment. Well, I think it's important that we understand whether clearly is a place for probing amendments and trying to understand the rationale employed by the Scottish Government in presenting the bill as it has. However, it's a very large however, any piece of any amendment which would remove protection, and that would be the effect of amendments 105 and 105 for intersex people and people with variation in sex characteristics, which has been in place, again, like the previous discussion we had for 10 years, is completely and utterly unacceptable. So programming or not, there's no place for it, and I hope it would. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Finney. No other member has indicated that they wish to take part in the debate on this group, so can I call the Cabinet Secretary to respond to what he's heard, please? Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. I know from the outset that Liam Kerr has said he wishes to bring forward these amendments as largely as probing amendments and to generate a discussion and debate. And I agree that stage 2 is often a good place for that discussion and that debate. Amendments 106, 108, 111 and 116, they seek to replace instances of the term VSE, variations in sex characteristics, with differences in sex development. I am aware, as Liam Kerr pointed out in his contribution, that there are differing views on the terminology that should be used. I think all of us recognise the sensitivity of using the correct terminology. The decision to use variations in sex characteristics was based on it being increasingly used more often by stakeholders. For example, I know in a call for evidence issued in January 2019, the UK Government's Equalities Office used the term variations in sex characteristics. People with a variation might, of course, refer to their specific variation or diagnosis, but it's necessary for the legislation to be able to refer to them as a group. I know also that some organisations and individuals would prefer to use the wording proposed here by Liam Kerr. I do recognise that. However, on introducing the bill, we took cognizance of the association and sometimes confusion between the terms differences in sex development and the more outdated disorders in sex development. This further contributed to our decision to proceed with the term variations in sex characteristics in the bill. We want to use a term that has the maximum possible amount of support from our stakeholders. Turning to Liam Kerr's alternative option, which is to remove the protection offered by the Hate Crime Legislative Framework for those with variations in sex characteristics, that does give me concern. As committee members will know, the Offences Aggravation by Prejudice Scotland Act 2009 lists intersexuality as part of the definition of transgender identity. However, whilst the wording of the 2009 Act reflects understanding of the position at that time, this is no longer the case. Therefore, the bill removes intersexuality from the definition of transgender identity, given the clear differences between people with variations in sex characteristics and people with transgender identities. But so as not to lose that protection for that group of people, the bill includes VSE as a separate characteristic within hate crime law. I recognise, excuse me, that there remains a lack of consensus on the issue on whether VSE should be included as a characteristic in the bill at all. This was highlighted when the committee took evidence from a number of stakeholders, as I say, who have differing views. And I'd like to offer reassurance that I do recognise the need to consider all the issues which concern people with variations in sex characteristics, including health issues. I think we can do that and ensure that they receive the adequate protection in the criminal law against hatred. Amendments 105, 110 and 115 in Liam Kerr's name, when read with Amendment 16 in Group 10, would entirely remove the protection offered by the law to these individuals. I do not believe that is the correct way forward, and for these reasons I cannot support any of the amendments in this group, and I urge members to vote against them.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Could I ask Liam Kerr to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 105, please, Mr. Kerr?
Thank you, Convener, and again, thank you to Mr. Finney and the Cabinet Secretary for their contributions. I can start, of course, by reassuring Mr. Finney in particular that no one's seeking to remove protections. I think this is an important debate, particularly reflecting the differences in evidence that we heard in the committee, and I'm grateful to him for bringing up the Klinefelter's evidence that we heard from and that we've had submitted. So I think it's an important debate. I think it's important that people hear that debate. But I absolutely can reassure both members that I'm not looking to press Amendment 105. I'm not looking to reduce the protections. In terms of the definition amendments, I agree with the Cabinet Secretary. I think this is an interesting debate because I don't know the answer. I think there are interesting points made by all contributors. And I've listened very carefully to what the Cabinet Secretary was saying there. I think it likely that I will not be pressing those amendments later on. Having listened to what the Cabinet Secretary has said, I shall reflect on it. We will no doubt hear from people who have a view, who may seek to guide us, but that's where I'm at, Convener. I will not be pressing Amendment 105 and may well take the same view on the other amendments in this group.
Thank you very much, Liam. So Mr. Kerr wishes to withdraw Amendment 105. Are members content that Amendment 105 be withdrawn? Members are content. I call Amendment 106 in the name of Liam Kerr, already debated with Amendment 105. Liam Kerr to move or not move?
Not moved, Convener.
That is not moved. The question is that Section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. That takes things as far as we can take them today, colleagues. We will recommence with stage 2 next week, and the clerks will be in touch in due course with everyone to confirm arrangements. That concludes our meeting today, and our next meeting will be on Tuesday, the 9th of February. I now close this meeting and wish everybody a good day.